Ron Colman is the Executive Director of GPI Atlantic, which has spent the past decade developing a genuine progress index for the Canadian province of Nova Scotia. And in that capacity, he's already done a fine green interview, which is posted elsewhere on this site. Dr. Colman's Nova Scotia work led to an engagement with the Royal Government of Bhutan to help that country implement and assess its policy of maximizing gross national happiness as opposed to gross national product. In this second interview, he focuses on these developments in Bhutan, and in particular on the workshop on education for gross national happiness that he organized for the Royal Government. I was fortunate enough to attend that workshop as an observer, and when I had this conversation with Ron Colman some months later, I was fascinated to hear his account of the impact of that workshop on the educational system in that brave little Himalayan kingdom. If somebody comes up to you and says, "Where is this place? What's it like?" What do you say?
Well, it's, I think one of the main things is that it's quite precarious from a political demographic point of view, because a very small country sandwiched between two giants, India on one border and China on the other border. That creates a certain reality that pervades the country's existence, because to the south, Sikkim has been swallowed by India, and Sikkim, you could say, was analogous to Bhutan in some ways, and Tibet, which is on the other border of Bhutan, was swallowed by China. So it's not it's not as if there's no precedent for small countries being swallowed by very large neighbors. So I think that one has to appreciate the precariousness of Bhutan's sovereignty. That's a key factor. So I think part of Bhutan's determination to maintain some sense of cultural national identity stems from that reality. On the other hand, it is surrounded by high mountains. It is perched up in the Himalayas, and that's provided a natural protection for the country. Very little arable land because of the mountains. It's a small country in terms of size, something like Switzerland, but like Switzerland, they say it would be very large if it were flattened out. But it's a population of less than 700,000 people, so quite small. But also unique in some ways. It has never been conquered. It's been independent for quite a period of time, so it wasn't part of the colonial empires of Britain, France, Portugal, Netherlands. So it maintained its independence. So and has a very rich, long cultural history, which has, in a way, shaped the thinking and view and understanding of the people, and that particular cultural history, I think, is quite significant in understanding Bhutan's present development path. It's not as if its present development path of gross national happiness comes out of nowhere. It's not just a modern invention. It actually has roots in a very long cultural history. So I think there's that socio-political reality. And I think that gross national happiness as a development philosophy also has to be seen as a way of identifying and preserving that country's uniqueness. Because even in Canada, we have to struggle to preserve our national heritage and identity against the overwhelming influence of American television and celebrities and influence. So we're always trying to protect the Canadian content and Canadian this, that, and the other. So some special effort has to be made when you have very large and very powerful neighbors with a very wide reach, especially when those neighbors are burgeoning politically, militarily, economically. India and China are the emerging giants of the world. So even more in that background, I think that Bhutan has to be seen as preserving its uniqueness with some kind of special determination.
Tell me a little bit about the what you see when you get there. I'm thinking about the architecture. I'm thinking about the flags all over the place. There's a whole sense of who these people are that's actually visible as you drive around.
Yeah, I think that that cultural inheritance is both quite deeply felt in people's manners and style and interactions. I mean, you know, even it's quite common if you go into a grocery store and buy some article that it will be handed to you with both hands almost as an offering. Or if a tourist comes and goes into a hotel, they'll find that kind of offering gesture, mudra almost, you know, that's given. So those, you know, the cultural inheritance is felt in the interactions of the people and also quite visibly in the architecture, which has been maintained over a long period of time, in the living landscapes. Bhutanese associate living spirits in lakes, mountains, forests, which therefore have a kind of protection from those spirits, which are regarded as guardian deities of those places. So a lot of the tendency towards environmental protection actually also is related to that cultural inheritance. And you'll see everywhere pictures of the kings. Bhutan is very proud of a century of benevolent and wise leadership. They're quite proud of that. They're very fortunate in having had monarchs who have really governed in the interests of the people. I think it also needs to be said that it's not, it's maybe too easy to go the other direction and somehow paint Bhutan as if it were a Shangri-La in which everything is just hunky-dory and perfect in every way. By no means is that the case. Bhutan has major challenges. Some people will argue quite strongly that Bhutan's gross national happiness philosophy is not applied to the whole population. Bhutan has had a major issue with members of population who are of Nepali origin, where there's been a lot of disputes. Some are refugees who claim citizenship in Bhutan. Bhutan says that some of them had migrated illegally, so there's a major controversy on the Nepali origin refugee issue, and whether even among non-Bhutanese who are not of Nepali origin, there are people who argue that some of the development in the western part of the country has been at the expense of the eastern part of the country. Bhutan does have several different languages, and the national language, Dzongkha, is the native language of the people in the west, but there are probably more native speakers of Sharchop in the east than of Dzongkha in the west. So there are many major issues, you know, that have to do with diversity, and so Bhutan has its own challenges, and I would say the greatest challenge of all is how to handle its opening up to the world. Television is relatively new. It's 12 years old. Internet is new. And Bhutanese are now being bombarded as never before with consumerist, individualist messages that have very little connection with their own cultural heritage. So how to preserve that quite rich wisdom tradition, where there's a lot of precious knowledge and understanding against this materialist barrage which is now entering into Bhutan. I think that's probably, and at the same time, Bhutanese want to develop. I mean, they are establishing rural health clinics in parts of the country that previously had no health care. They've massively reduced infant mortality. So average lifespan of Bhutanese has virtually doubled in the last few decades. So there are advantages to development, and both economic, health, education, but how to manage that development so that the advantages of prosperity filter down to all levels of the population, and in such a way that the beautiful environment of the place, the cultural heritage of the place is not imperiled. So that's the challenge which the development philosophy of gross national happiness tries to address. That's the big challenge.
It's a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge.
Huge challenge, yeah.
And the Prime Minister said at one point, I know, that he could see some deterioration in the attitudes of even very young children in quite remote places.
Yes.
Over the last, say, decade or so. Yeah.
Yes, there's no, and also there's very strong, as there is in most countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, strong rural-urban migration, and that brings its own challenges and issues. First of all, those left on the farms, left in the villages, now are getting older and older. Young people coming to the capital city, Thimphu, are often cut off from their old social ties that gave them a sense of social support, social network. Sometimes when they come to the city, they can't find the opportunities that they thought were there, and now there's the beginnings of a drug problem that didn't used to be there. So there are major challenges that are facing Bhutan with development. And at the same time, we have to acknowledge that Bhutan is trying to handle those challenges in a way that's quite unique, and that are perhaps potentially a model for other countries if they really work. If Bhutan's more holistic approach to development is effective and shown to be successful, then I think other countries, particularly in Asia, Africa, Latin America, have a lot to learn from it, because those countries have not necessarily been well served by the Western model of development and growing dependence on export crops and resource exploitation and so forth. So I think that there's tremendous potential in Bhutan's attempt to move forward in a different way.
Yeah, it's a gallant rowing against the international stream in a way, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely going against the international stream, no question about it.
Which brings us right around to the workshop, but actually before we get there, let's talk a little bit about gross national happiness, because is it fair to say that when the fourth king made that rather offhand remark to a journalist in the early 1970s that gross national happiness is more important than gross national product, I have the impression that he said something that was in his heart, that he truly believed, but he may have even surprised himself by saying it. And then over the years, it's been like a basket that's been woven, but the contents have been added and added and added, so that it's now a much more sophisticated approach than perhaps even the king would have imagined when he said that. Is that evolution fair to describe?
I think, well, the Prime Minister put it this way. He said there's three phases in the evolution of gross national happiness. When the fourth king first made that pronouncement, it was somehow intuitively felt. And the basic intuitive understanding was that material accumulation is not the only thing that matters in people's lives. And I think that's something that we're understanding as well, more and more in the West, that it's not just more stuff and more buying and more purchases that are the only contributor to well-being. We're finding that people's levels of satisfaction and happiness are not necessarily going up the more stuff they have. So I think that initially, perhaps for 20 years, that statement by the king was largely intuitive and felt, understood, without needing much explanation or definition. Then as Bhutan opened up more to the world, particularly starting in the late 1990s, and in the last decade in particular, there's been more and more pressure on Bhutanese to say, well, what do you mean by this gross national happiness? And in some ways that pressure to define it and explain it has come somewhat from outside, actually. So as Bhutan has become a member of the United Nations and established more diplomatic relations and joined international organizations and become a member of the South Asia regional grouping, the pressure to explain it has become greater. And also as Bhutan has moved towards democracy, full parliamentary democracy, there's been some greater effort to define what we mean by gross national happiness, so it's not simply a political football that's in with one political party and out with the next, that it represents something more enduring about the country's path and identity and development that goes beyond politics. So in all of that effort, in the last 10 years, there's been considerable work done defining gross national happiness, explaining it, even measuring it. Even how would we measure our progress according to gross national happiness indicators? So we have 4 pillars of gross national happiness which are intended to be in harmony with each other. Equitable and sustainable economic development, environmental conservation, cultural promotion, and good governance. So the idea is that Bhutan's development would balance those 4 elements. And then in seeking to measure gross national happiness, those 4 pillars have been broken down into 9 domains. So the health of the population, educational attainment, cultural richness, the vitality of communities, the quality of the environment, economic security and living standards. So all of these components are now measured and quantified. So the second stage, you might say, is defining, explaining, quantifying, measuring. So gross national happiness now has flesh and blood and bones and, statistical reality, which it didn't have 10 years ago. So that's in a way a second phase. And I think that's been accomplished with some success. There's been a national survey. There are results. There's now a second survey in the field. So all of this has happened. Now, Bhutan's Prime Minister says we're entering a third phase, which is implementing gross national happiness in action. We have to actually make it a living reality that's manifest in all our institutions, in the way we make policy, most recently in our educational system, in every which way. Gross national happiness, he says, has to become part of the living fabric of Bhutanese society. So already in the last year, there's been the development of a policy screening tool. So all policies are now supposed to be passed through this screening tool to assess, will they enhance or detract from all the pillars of gross national happiness? Will they improve environmental conservation or detract from? Will they imperil our cultural heritage or will they strengthen it? So that's one aspect. Now, the curriculum, the school curriculum that the Bhutanese inherited was largely from British colonial India, very little relationship to the country's own values, and very often rote learning. And so now there's an attempt to reform and recast the educational system so it genuinely reflects that holistic view of the world. That, and this is, by the way, part of the cultural heritage too, because the interdependent, interconnected nature of reality is fundamental teaching of Buddhism. And so the Buddhist heritage of the country, you could say, is reflected in a more holistic view of development that understands the interconnected relation between social, economic, and environmental and cultural realities. So now this, in its official statements, Bhutan is saying that we're really entering this full implementation phase at this point, and really beginning full-blown with the educational system, which, by the way, it's very important to understand, is not going to be at the expense of intellectual rigor and all of the things which we would expect. A student is still going to have to learn to read and write and multiply and add and subtract. So the basic and science, the basic nuts and bolts, but how that subject matter is taught, the manner in which it's conveyed and in which students learn, will be infused with these principles, values, and practices of gross national happiness.
Which brings us around precisely to the conference that you were that you organized. And I guess number one, how did you get involved with this? I mean, how does somebody who's been doing wonderful work in St. Margaret's Bay, Nova Scotia, end up in Thimphu? So that's number one. And then number two, what was the project that you were asked to do?
Well, I mean, I want to make it clear, when you say you organize, really that's not the case. This was an initiative of the government of Bhutan. So it was actually an initiative from the Prime Minister himself. He said it was a deeply held, long-term dream of his to actually not just see gross national happiness in action in every facet of society, but particularly as a first step to see it brought into the educational system. So this was completely initiative of the government, and we were simply asked to help with some of the organizational work, and that's based on some years of association. We did host the Second International Conference on Gross National Happiness here in Nova Scotia in 2005. And at that conference, the current Prime Minister, Health Minister, Education Minister, and others were all present there. We've had an even longer association in working on these measurements, because our work is on measuring progress in a more holistic way. That's our Genuine Progress Index work, is exactly on that. So as the Bhutanese were beginning to develop measures of gross national happiness, they sought some technical advice from us on how these things could be measured, on how a survey could be constructed to gather the evidence, on constructing their database. So some of the technical assistance we were able to help with. Really our involvement goes back originally to that, and then I would say secondarily to hosting the Second International Conference on Gross National Happiness, and then really responding to this request to organize this workshop which would bring international educators to consult with Bhutanese educators and officials on how this could be done. So in a nutshell, we identified educators from 5 different approaches which we thought were relevant to Bhutan's gross national happiness philosophy. Sustainability education and ecological literacy being one. Contemplative education, because Bhutan hasn't simply relegated its spiritual side to the churches alone. A part of the cultural heritage of the country is quite a rich spiritual tradition which is held in quite great respect societally. So contemplative education, and in fact meditation is now being introduced in schools throughout Bhutan, which I think is a national first in the world, that meditation is actually being brought into the classroom, but it's being found to help students concentrate, to focus, to make them more present, to reduce their discursiveness. And so it's actually, I think, from an academic point of view, going to prove to be quite beneficial. So sustainability education, contemplative education, holistic education, which tries to approach education from the perspective of joining what they called head, heart, hands. So the feeling, emotional, spiritual side of education with the rational, intellectual side, and the doing side, the practical side. So trying to bring a more holistic approach to education. A fourth approach is indigenous knowledge. So most curricula are Western influence. They come from the Western tradition. So how to bring this local knowledge? It would be the equivalent of making a major effort here in Canada, say, to bring the knowledge of our indigenous peoples, of our First Nations, into our education system. I mean, it's almost inconceivable. Our curricula are so Western oriented that we can barely think of what does it really mean to incorporate indigenous knowledge in our regular curriculum. So we brought some people with real expertise in that area. Gregory Cajete, for example, a Tewa Indian who teaches in the University of New Mexico, written several books, PhD in this area. So he's had real experience in trying to bring that indigenous knowledge from North America into educational systems. And the fifth broad field is critical thinking. And that really is designed to strengthen the intellectual rigor of the system. So students should come out of this system more intellectually acute, more capable of becoming engineers and professors and doctors and scientists or whatever else they want to become. So not only should none of this be at the expense of that, but on the contrary, students' minds should be sharper at the end of this process. And that's particularly important because of what I mentioned earlier about young Bhutanese particularly being barraged by these commercials, messages, television, all the messages that they need to be able to distinguish the truth from the morass of misinformation and manipulation to which they're subject. So how do they distinguish what's genuine and true from what's just manipulation? So that critical thinking, and for that, for example, we had Dr. Henry Rosemont from Brown University, who's written some wonderful materials on critical thinking, critical analysis. So those were the 5 streams of education. There we had experts come and engage in a dialogue with Bhutanese policymakers and education officials. Education minister, education secretary were all there for the full conference. Prime Minister attended for a good part, and other senior officials and educators from the Ministry of Education, Teachers College, Vice Chancellor of the Royal University of Bhutan. They were all present. So we had a week-long dialogue on how this could be done. And Bhutanese government was very, very quick to act. They decided during that workshop to assemble all the principals of the country for 3 week-long workshops to initiate them into the new methods. So following that workshop in January and February, we had about 750 principals, district education officers, assistant education officers from around the country all come together for 3 week-long sessions introducing them to the new methods. Everything from introducing meditation into the classroom to working with curricula content to the extracurricular activities of the school, school atmosphere and management, schools as agents of community service, serving their communities, extending themselves to their communities, expanding the assessment system so it's not based just on these standardized exams, but assesses students' capacities in a more holistic way. And again, this critical thinking component, which was always present.
It's been a fascinating evolution, and I gather it's been well received. I mean, you would often expect a teacher or a principal to be quite resistant to a change as dramatic as this, and I gather that hasn't really been much of an obstacle.
Well, I recently visited 16 schools in the eastern part of Bhutan and had quite lengthy meetings with their principals, then separate meetings with the teachers, and often with school assemblies and going into individual classes and talking to students. And I have to say that I was amazed, really surprised at not only was there no resistance that I encountered, I didn't hear of any, but on the contrary, I was amazed at the enthusiasm that I heard. I also would have expected more resistance. Well, this is the way we've always done things, and people are trained in a certain way and they're used to a certain thing, and this is opening up a whole new kettle of fish. So, but the kinds of remarks I heard, this would be typical. One school principal said, aha, at last I know what my job is really about. He said, I always knew that it had more to do, that there was something more than just administering the school and getting students through exams. We had these young people with us for 7-8 hours a day, and they were with us at least as much as with their own parents, and our job with them was more than just getting them through the exams and administering this institution, administering pays. He said, now I know what my job is. It's really to raise these people as full human beings, as full citizens who can really contribute to their country, who are informed and understand the world, and it's to raise human beings, as opposed to perform on some standardized exam. And by the way, those who don't perform well on the standardized exams very often feel themselves to be failures in the conventional system. But the idea that every student has something to offer, there's space within this approach to nurture students' talents and capacities in a much bigger way. So I found that teachers were very enthused about the importance of their role finally being acknowledged for what it really was. They finally felt as if someone had said, oh yes, the job you're doing matters. I mean, suddenly educators are being positioned as, the consciousness of young people is happening right here. You're playing a major role in the evolution of these young people's consciousness, who they are, the way they'll think of the world, the way they'll take this country in the future. And you're one-on-one, you're the front line, you're working with them. So suddenly their role was being elevated to a much higher level. And I found that they were just, even though that might never have even been said in those words, but somehow they understood that their role was important, that the future of the country is in the balance. If young people are just completely swallowed by the lure of Western materialism and consumerism and buy more, spend more, get rich, and have a successful career, whatever form of individual aggrandizement we honor, and celebrate through our celebrity culture, I mean, if that's going to be the model for young Bhutanese, then within one generation there'll be no gross national happiness, that'll just be a fond memory of the past maybe, and Bhutan will go down the development path of virtually every other country in the world. So teachers suddenly realized that this was a crucial point in Bhutan's evolution, and they had a role to play, not to stifle opening to the world. It might sound as if it's, no, but to be able to handle the world in a way that brings to bear the rich cultural tradition that goes back more than 1,000 years, ancient tradition of the country that has values of caring and generosity and community and spiritual exploration and deep respect for the natural world. It's a part of Buddhist philosophy that you don't take the life of another being, not just another human being, but another being. So bringing that understanding to bear, the world needs that. So I think that teachers are aware of the power and importance of their role at this particular point in Bhutanese history and appreciating the trust that they've been given. Yeah.
Fabulous. It's what a transformation in the teachers' feeling about themselves. What an inspiration for them to proceed in that way.
Yeah, rather than it just being, in the past, quite frankly, the success of the teacher has been measured by what percentage of the students do they get through the exams with what grades, and I think all of them knew that there's more to it than that. But, now in all of that, I have to say, this is not to say that there are not immense challenges ahead, huge challenges. The implementation is not going to be easy. It means producing new curricular materials, because one of the things that the teacher said was, okay, yes, but now we need the tools to take into the classroom. We need new kinds of lesson plans. We need examples. How do we do this? So those materials have to be developed. All the principals in the country took a vow, made a pledge to create green schools. I don't think that's ever been done nationally. One school here and there has done it, but on a national scale for all the schools to do it, but how to do it, how to implement it. It means more than just litter-free. It means building design, building materials, bringing the students into nature, bringing nature into the classroom. It's a profound thing to create a green school. So the implementation will not be quick and easy, and no country has ever tried to do this on a national scale. Introducing meditation into schools is huge. Most of the principals and teachers are not trained meditation instructors. So, and meditation is profound discipline. So some schools have introduced 2 minutes at the beginning of every class, and they're reporting good results from this. But nevertheless, meditation is a process which, as it goes deeper, requires further instruction, and it's a path in itself that requires new training. So curriculum materials, training, there's a lot to be done for this before we can say with confidence that this is a living reality. We're not there yet.
But what a wonderful start.
Yes, the inspiration is good.
Yeah.
Yes.
The foreign participants, one of the striking things about this is that this little country, which has been so cut off from the world, and that's not really the right wording for it, but you don't understand what I mean. It's been so much off on its own and on its own path, and has been phenomenally welcoming to the people that you've called to that conference, right?
Yes.
And I gather that they have continued to be involved.
Yes. So, for example, when the principals took that pledge to create green schools, so we drew on the expertise of people who came to that conference. For example, we had the presidents of the Children and Nature Network and the Center for Eco-Literacy in the United States. These were the top people in those organizations. Professor David Orr from Oberlin College. So these people helped us create a small manual for school principals. So we actually gave them a green schools manual, so at least they could get started. And some of the people who came to that conference have helped us compile a very user-friendly meditation manual, which was distributed to all of the school principals. So we have had some very heartening, ongoing collaboration and involvement with those people. So people who came, I think the feeling I got is that everybody had a strong sense that this was important not only for Bhutan. It's not only Bhutan which is questioning whether the philosophy of getting ahead and having financial and career successes, is that the only thing that the world needs, or even that the individual needs, let alone the community? Or is there something we've been missing that has to do with caring for the earth, caring for each other, caring for communities? Is there some element that has somehow been regarded as just extra curriculum that needs to come from the fringe to the mainstream? So I think that these international educators are not simply being altruistic and helping out Bhutan. I think that their motivation is that they feel that this particular path of educational transformation matters for the world and matters for their own countries and their own communities. So I think that this has enough universal resonance that they're not simply, I think it's a mistake to see it as Bhutan and the international people as if this group is helping that. On the contrary, I think that the international educators are learning as much from the Bhutanese experience and from the Bhutanese approach. So I think it's very much a two-way stream and a two-way collaboration with potential for implementation and application beyond Bhutan's borders.
16 countries those educators came from, right?
Yep, we had at the forum, we had people from 16 different countries, actually. Yeah.
Remarkable.
And we had directors and founders of schools, which are potential models. You see, even though no country has ever tried to do this with its national educational system, there are individual schools which have adopted these principles. So we had directors and principals, founders of schools, alternative schools we might call them, which are both academically successful, but which also have nurtured this care for the environment, deep appreciation of culture. Schools from Canada, United States, we had Ross School from New York, schools from India, United Kingdom, Thailand. So we had several representatives of model schools from different countries around the world represented.
One last thing, and that is that underlying all of this is really fabulous leadership. I mean, leadership that really knows and understands and values its own country, its own people, and that's willing to be extremely bold in taking a departure. I mean, 600,000 people, this is an amazing thing to have happen. And yet, in that 600,000 people, there obviously are some incredible leaders and people with great vision and courage.
Yes, there are.
And one that strikes me very strongly is the Prime Minister.
Yes.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about him and about those of his associates that you think particularly should be credited with.
Well, I think that's true, and the Bhutanese maybe take for granted that they've had 100 years of benevolent government. But it's quite unusual in the world today to have that. Too noisy?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, one more time.
We're going to start again.
Okay.
All right. Anytime?
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about the remarkable leadership of the country.
Okay. I think the Bhutanese have maybe taken for granted the 100 years of quite benevolent leadership that they've had. But actually it's quite remarkable and unusual in the world. It's no coincidence that good governance is one of the 4 key pillars of gross national happiness. And of course that good governance, along with environmental conservation, cultural promotion, and sustainable and equitable economic development, good governance is one of the four main ones. And of course that consists of everything from an informed electorate to participation at the grassroots level in voting, trust and accountability, but also includes the element of leadership. Is the leadership self-interested, or is it really in the interests of the people? And I think that the Bhutanese, almost without exception, I mean, I've never heard otherwise, even in frank personal conversations, they basically do feel that their monarchs have given them that benevolent, enlightened leadership. I think particularly people feel so grateful for the third and fourth kings for having launched them on a path that they really feel has been completely in their interest of the people. The Prime Minister calls himself a disciple of the fourth king. It was the fourth king who came up with the notion of gross national happiness. So even though now we have a full parliamentary democracy, the Prime Minister very much regards the fourth king as his mentor. And the fifth king also, the present young king, is very, very popular. He's really called the people's king. When after the earthquake that Bhutan had about 18 months ago, he went around personally and visited the earthquake victims, slept on the floors of villages' kitchens, and really tried to give them every support and encouragement that he could. So I think that tradition of caring for the people, being out there, and is still very much alive and very strong. The Prime Minister himself has very, in my experience, a very profound sense of vision. He's a very committed environmentalist. I mean, he will speak a language on the natural world that you just don't hear from other world leaders, even those who are, have commitments. Somehow his understanding of ecology and of the human dependence on the natural world is very profound. His appreciation of nature and human relationship with nature is deep. And as part of that enlightened leadership, we have to give some credit to the cultural traditions of the country, because I think there's no question that the Buddhist and Hindu philosophies, and those are the two main spiritual traditions of the country, have valued nonviolence. They valued, they have deep respect for a contemplative approach, a spiritual approach to reality that's ameliorated the kind of materialism that we've become accustomed to. So I think that's also become part of the leadership tradition. There's some drawing on that cultural heritage and the wisdom of the forefathers, so to speak. I think you can still feel the wisdom of the forefathers reflected in the policy arena. There's not, but again, I don't want to paint too rosy a picture, because with the coming of democracy, there has, quite frankly, been much more suspicion that people have. Are our parliamentarians becoming more self-interested and feathering their own beds, or just, trying to act in their own interests? So the suspicions that we're used to in our democratic system of, they've come to the surface in Bhutan, as Bhutan has made that very radical shift from absolute monarchy to parliamentary democracy. We're hearing more of that suspicion, are the politicians really just politicians in it for themselves, or are they really here for us? So I think we have both now. We do still have some real wisdom at the top, some real caring and understanding. Prime Minister said that gross national happiness is not sought by trying to find happiness for oneself, but by working for the happiness of others. That's how you find your own sense of satisfaction and happiness. So that kind of wisdom is quite rare in the world. You know, it's quite different from the individualist, get ahead, you know, step on whoever you need to step on to get to where you want to go. It's there's some sense of caring community that's part of the leadership philosophy, and at the same time, Bhutanese are human beings, and they're not immune to the kind of materialist, consumerist tendencies that human beings have. You know, people are, they have their own desires. So some parliamentarians, when they were first elected, they made a big deal about getting their special parliamentary number plates and special parliamentary insignia. And, you know, a lot of people didn't like that. They thought, oh, you know, they're feathering their own privilege and feathering their own beds. And so we need to, I think, always acknowledge that Bhutan is at a crossroads. Yes, it has a tradition of wise leadership that you could argue goes all the way back hundreds and hundreds of years through the great spiritual masters who are now studied in the West, actually, you know, who Padmasambhava, who is really an icon well beyond the borders of Bhutan, but who lived and taught in Bhutan, you know. So I think some of that history of enlightened leadership really goes back a long way and is still manifest in ways that we can see today. And I have great respect for Prime Minister's vision and understanding and his intellectual acuity and his commitment. It's quite remarkable, quite remarkable. But at the same time, I also see the, you know, the other side that particularly has come along with, I would say, with democracy. You know, it's the underbelly of democracy, you could say. And sometimes democracy produces lowest common denominator. I mean, look, you know, the Americans voted for George W. Bush twice. They voted for him a second time after they had witnessed him in action for 4 years. They'd had a chance to observe him and then voted him in again. So one has to ask whether democracy always produces the most enlightened and wise leadership, or whether it sometimes, you know, appeals to just, you know, what do we need to say to get the votes? And that can dumb down. So democracy does have the capacity to dumb down leadership. It has that possibility.
Which is why gross national happiness in the schools is so important, because there's a certain sense in which the wise leadership grows out of a wise population, right?
Yes, absolutely. And I think the hope is that, you know, incredible daring and courage that fourth king had in abdicating from power, giving up his power in his 50s. He was quite young and healthy and hearty, and certainly people didn't want democracy. They loved their king, you know. But he understood that this was the way Bhutan had to go into the future, that the future wasn't one of monarchs. It was, and in a way, the philosophy of gross national happiness and the inclusion of good governance as a pillar is a tremendous entrusting of the people, passing along the history of wise and enlightened leadership to the people and saying, okay, now it's in your hands. So voting is not just a right, but a major responsibility. And if we want to carry this history and tradition of wise leadership into the future and benevolent leadership into the future, that every Bhutanese citizen is now individually responsible for making that happen. So that's a big leap. And in a way, some kind of hope that Bhutanese democracy might not simply dumb things down to a lowest common denominator, but actually demonstrate a different kind of democracy in which votes are cast in a really responsible way.
In a way, what we have in the West is a democracy of consumers who expect to be served and to get stuff.
Yeah.
And if you can preserve that alternative way of looking at things in Bhutan, then you get a really responsible citizen, not just a consumer of government.
That's the goal. That's the intent, and that's certainly the view of gross national happiness, which is being brought into the educational system. In the end, I would say I can't bet one way or the other, whether that'll be successful or not. I think it hangs in the balance. I think that and some of those issues that we dealt with earlier are still major issues. There's the issue of equity among the diverse sections of the population. There's a strong Buddhist culture, but there's also a strong Hindu culture, and the mutual respect and collaboration and respect for diversity, finding the common threads. There are the education minister, by the way, is of Nepali origin and devout Hindu. So I think that's a very positive sign, and he is very eloquent and very, very committed to the philosophy of gross national happiness. So I think there are some very hopeful signs in terms of the leadership and the development of commitment to this holistic view and of genuine vision. So I think that there's every possibility that this could be a model of development that is highly relevant to the world. More than that, I would say, which the world desperately needs and is looking for, because our conventional materialist consumerist approach is destroying the world. I think it's, if it has not already, about degraded resources, and put an increasing burden on the young rather than created opportunities. So I think there are, the world needs this. Whether it will happen or not is still to be answered.
Dr. Ron Colman, talking about Bhutan's attempt to infuse the idea of gross national happiness into the national curriculum, and thus into every schoolroom in the country. This interview is part of our special presentation on Bhutan, which also includes a short documentary on gross national happiness in Bhutan, an interview with Prime Minister Jigme Thinley, and various print materials. If you enjoyed this conversation, you may also want to look at some of these other materials, and perhaps you'll want to hear Ron Coleman's earlier Green interview on the Genuine Progress Index. For the Green interview, I'm Silver Donald Cameron. See you next time.